Welcome back to Archaeology After Dark, everyone. Thank you again for joining us. And as a lot of you know, it is Archaeology Month here in Alabama. So I thought I'd invite somebody to talk about archaeology here in Alabama a little bit. So my guest today is Rachel Hines. Rachel, thanks for being here.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me.
Absolutely. So tell us a little bit about yourself.
I am an archaeologist and I work in Alabama, as you mentioned. I'm from Minnesota originally, and so I went to my undergrad at the University of Minnesota, got a bachelor's in anthropology, as many archaeologists do, and set out to work. I worked mostly for the federal government to start out, Forest Service, Park Service, and doing the seasonal thing. And as I was out working, I started feeling like, why are we doing all of this wonderful work if we're not sharing it with people more? And I felt like the work that I was doing never really made it past our site forms and our reports. And so I really started to focus on how do we share public archaeology or share archaeology with the public. And so now I think of myself as more of a public archaeologist. When people stop me and ask me kind of what is my specialty in archaeology, I'm usually like, well, I like it all. I just like sharing it. So so I kind of pivoted and I went to University of West Florida to get my master's because I wanted to work with the Florida Public Archaeology Network. I had a awesome graduate assistantship there. And now I have a master's in historical archaeology. And I'm currently working as the public outreach coordinator at the University of South Alabama. So this is kind of my dream job because it brings together the archaeology and the doing and the new discoveries, but I also get to share it in whatever way I can think of. So that's what I'm up to.
And I think what you said resonates with a lot of people that I've talked to in the field is outside of, conferences and things, there aren't a lot of ways for people to actually share their research. So public archaeology, I think, ties in really well with that.
Yeah, definitely. And when I'm out talking to archaeologists in particular, I've talked to, since I'm at University of South Alabama, I talked to our students. And I was just telling you, I was at Troy a couple weeks ago and I was talking to their students. And I always tell people, I personally think everyone should be a public archaeologist. And there's so many different ways to share what we're doing. A lot of us are introverts, but there are ways where you don't even really have to make that face-to-face interaction just by sharing on social media or having a blog or a website. There's just so many different ways to share what we're up to. So I think everyone can kind of find a little niche for themselves that works.
So you mentioned introverts, and I've met a lot of people in the field who are like that too. For people who have difficulties connecting with their community as archaeologists, what would you recommend they do?
Yeah, I'm an introvert, so so I can relate to that. Yeah, I don't know. Growing up, I feel like I was more of an extrovert, but I kind of credit archaeology with making me an introvert because I moved so many times, and especially when I was working with the National Park Service, sometimes there would be no community there. I would be living alone and camping for my job and not talking to anybody and I think I just got used to kind of being in my shell a little bit more through time. So yeah, I could definitely relate to people feeling like yeah, a little bit apprehensive about talking to the public. I think it just kind of depends who you are. Like for me personally, I could talk to a crowd of 200 people, no problem. But then it's kind of like the smaller groups of 10 people that make me a little bit more nervous. But for some people, they prefer that kind of one-on-one small group interaction. So kind of like I was just saying, I think like everyone has something that they're probably comfortable with. If it's writing, there's so many different writing outlets out there. If it's, yeah, speaking, and but maybe in a more formal setting where you don't actually have to make eye contact with anybody, you can find those bigger opportunities to speak. I talked at Gulf State Park. They have this lecture series for their snowbirds, and they had like 170 people that showed up. It was the biggest crowd I've ever had, I can believe it. But it feels kind of impersonal. You're just like, they just become a blur of faces. And then, yeah, I think, it just gets better with practice. So the more you do it, the less scary it becomes because afterward, I've never really had anyone come up and be like, that was terrible or that wasn't interesting at all. Like everyone's always very excited to talk about it. So I think kind of getting that positive feedback helps too. But so many of us do so much writing with archaeology. So I think that's a really easy segue is to do. People always make fun of me for having our blog that we run for University of South Alabama. Like, who does a blog anymore? But it's there when people search for something, put keywords in there and it will pop right up. And I've had so many people reach out to me just from things that I've put on our blog. And the best part about it is that when my position ends, because I'm funded by the current project that we have going on. So when that funding ends, my position ends. But that blog will still be up there for people to access. So it kind of, yeah, creates a little bit more permanent knowledge for people to access once I go away.
Yeah, I think that's kind of one of the biggest goals of public archaeology is creating something that lasts, because people cycle out of their positions for one reason or another. They change jobs, they retire, but they want to leave the information there for people who need it.
Yeah, definitely. And that's like in my current role, that's one thing that I really tried to focus on because I got hired knowing that I would only be here for a couple years. And of course, I wanted to go out and I love doing talks. I love going to classrooms and things like that. But then I'm doing that knowing that only that one room is going to hear from me or only that one classroom will get to have that experience. And so I'm trying to do things with the lens to the future. So when I get classroom visits, I kind of use that as a way to like test out my ideas and see what the students like and what resonates with them and what goes over their head or what's way too easy. And then I've taken that back as we've talked about a little bit and formalize those lessons to something that any teacher could use in their classroom so that that activity exists past just me doing that activity. So that's kind of how I've tried to be efficient in this role and kind of be a little bit more sustainable in my approach. Similar to the blog, I'm trying to think about like what's going to last after I'm here, and then using those like face-to-face interactions as kind of like I don't know, like a test almost. Like what are people asking me, or what are people interested in? It's like kind of like a reconnaissance mission, and then I take all that information back and make kind of the more lasting things like exhibits and educational programs and our web content and things like that.
So you mentioned different approaches. So I assume you take a different approach when talking to like a classroom full of children as you would like say a local historical society or a local museum because the audiences are different.
Yeah, definitely. That's when people are kind of considering a program for the first time. That's the first thing I ask them is like, who is your audience and what do they want to know? And that's just key to keep in the forefront of our minds because there's a lot of things that we think are interesting. But there, some of that stuff does not translate very well to the average person. They might not find it that interesting. And also there's a lot of times a lot of context that they need to know before they can understand some of the more complex concepts that we might want to share with them. So usually when I'm giving a talk, I'll think like, what kind of knowledge do I think people are bringing to this, and what might they need to know to learn? Most of my public talks, I almost always start off with what is archaeology, or I'll just ask, especially like in a classroom. In Alabama, it's third grade that learns about archaeology, fourth grade that does Alabama history. So those are kind of the two classrooms that want to see an archaeologist most often. And so even though I know like in third grade, they're learning what archaeology is, and in the standards, it says they're supposed to be able to differentiate between archaeologists and paleontologists. Almost every single classroom I go into, if I ask them, hey, what do archaeologists do? Like, tell me about my job. I always get one that says that I look for fossils or I dig for dinosaurs. And so I always try to start off with what is archaeology, and unpacking that a little bit for people to really connect it, yeah, to what we do.
Yeah, I think that's something that, everybody who does public archaeology has to overcome at some point is what people's actual perception of archaeology is. They've seen Indiana Jones or Tomb Raider or something, and they ultimately assume that that's what archaeology is. But I've never seen Harrison Ford or whoever plays Tomb Raider now fill out actual site forms or write in a Sharpie on a Ziploc bag and put something in a box to take home with.
Yeah, I usually tell people it's a lot more boring than what they're imagining. And more, yeah, you need to be a lot more meticulous and detail oriented than people would probably imagine. So I tell them if they're type A, it's a job for them. If not, maybe not the best fit.
Yeah, people don't shoot at you as often as you might think when you're an archaeologist. If people are shooting at you, you're probably doing it incorrect.
Yeah, although, yeah, when you're working sometimes out in rural areas, you do have to be careful about property boundaries and things
Yeah.
like that. I've heard definitely some stories. So especially I used to work out in California, so our biggest fear was stumbling on a illegal pot growing. When we saw black PVC piping out in the forest, that's when you start walking the other direction. The site's not that important. So
And
you
that's
never
why
know.
and that's why it's good to take a botanist with you so they can tell you when you're stepping onto an illegal plot. So I imagine you've done a lot of different types of programs and things with the I10 project. You've mentioned the blog. What other experiences have you gotten from working on? It's been a huge project for those of you who are outside of the state of Alabama.
Yeah, so the I10 project is I didn't get to brand it because it already had a name when I became affiliated with it, but it's called the I10 Mobile River Bridge Archaeology Project. Everyone on the project calls it MRB, but when I'm out and about, I usually call it the I10 project just because it's a little bit more relatable for people that don't know Mobile River Bridge. But we've been for the last 3 years excavating 15 sites that were in the right of way of the I-10 bridge as it crosses Mobile Bay. And that field work actually wrapped up over a year ago. And then now we're still processing all the artifacts that go that we found there. So as everyone knows, it's a long process. There was a huge crew in the field. I mean, anywhere from, as you know, 10 to 20 people at a time working in the field, probably. And so the lab is a huge lift afterwards. But they're making progress. And so, as part of the I-10 project, um, it spans pretty much every time period in Mobile's history. We've got kind of every context you can imagine: houses, businesses, industry along the waterfront. And so because of that, especially with the big historical component and how visible it would be, Dr. Phil Carr, who's the principal investigator, wanted to do a huge oral history project, first of all, which has been absolutely amazing. But then also bring me on as a public outreach coordinator to share all the different work because it's taxpayer funded. And like I said, it was really visible when the field work was going on. So we were on the news pretty frequently, which was a new experience for me. But so my role has been kind of doing literally whatever I can think of to share all the work that we've been doing. And going back to what you asked about different audiences and different approaches, that is actually absolutely factored into kind of the types of programs that I do. And especially with a project that's funded by ALDOT, pretty much everyone in Alabama is our audience because it is a Alabama and actually federal highways funded project. So kind of everyone in the United States, but I don't know how interested necessarily they would be in this project. But when everyone is your audience, it makes it kind of challenging. So we've just kind of tried to go for everything we can think of. I kind of think of my job as having three different branches, like it's almost three different roles tied into one person. So one that I wasn't expecting as much and didn't have as much experience in was communications and public relations, which yeah, it was kind of a whole new world for me. So going on the news, working with print media to share what we've been up to, running our social media. We've got Facebook, Instagram, and we put videos on the Archaeology Museum's YouTube page. Um, yeah, just kind of all different types of communications to get the word out there. The web content, the blog, I kind of think of those as communication. So that has been a pretty big role in my project because since we've never had a public outreach coordinator at the Center for Archaeological Studies. None of those things existed. So we didn't have social media. We didn't really have a way to reach people. So that was kind of my first line of business was like, how do we grow an audience? How do we make a place for our products to go? And communications is the best way to do that. And then, of course, because while the field work was going on, it was so visible. It's like, how do we just let people know what these white tents are that they're driving by? And so, yeah, that has been probably the biggest learning process for me is that kind of communications hat. The second hat that I think of that I wear is being an educator, which is what I would say I had the most experience in. And so that is doing lectures, doing classroom visits, building the educational curriculum, doing exhibits. We've done some physical exhibits, a couple of traveling exhibits, and a temporary exhibit at the Archaeology Museum, and then also some virtual exhibits that are available on our website. So that's probably probably the role that I had the most experience in. Probably the one that's grown to be my favorite is kind of what I think of as my community engagement hat. Kind of that third bucket of things that I do, and that's really working with our stakeholder groups with this project. Because the interstate cut through a neighborhood when it was initially constructed. Most of our oral history interviews have been with people that either live in the neighborhood now or were displaced by the interstate initially getting constructed. And like most cities in the United States, Mobile falls into the same pattern where these interstates and also subsequent urban renewal efforts just totally ripped apart Black neighborhoods in Mobile and displaced residents to all different places in the city. And so a lot of our oral history interviews have focused on kind of like the neighborhood, it's called Down the Bay, before the interstate and after the interstate and how things have changed. And so with Dr. Kern Jackson, director of the African American Studies program at South, and then Dr. Ryan Marini, who's with the McCall Library, also at South, and he's an oral historian. They've collected over 100 interviews with people that live in the neighborhood or used to live in the neighborhood to learn more about what life was like and how it has changed as a result of all the development that's happened there. So probably my favorite part of my job has been doing specific work with that community. And so helping with the oral histories, we've kind of done traditional oral histories, but we did some fun ones too, where like we rode around the neighborhood in a bus and I like mapped the different locations that people pointed out and stuff like that. Um, and then I started a newsletter to kind of keep people updated on what was going on with the oral history project and share updates from the archaeology, updates from how the oral histories were being used, and things like that. And then we've done a bunch of different events to kind of bring people together and share what we've been finding, especially one of the big kind of motivators for doing those events was that the McCall Library at University of South Alabama has really amazing photo collections, including all of the records from the urban renewal project that kind of completely changed that down the Bay neighborhood. And those records from the urban renewal include photos of houses and businesses in the neighborhood, and appraisal documents and floor plans, all kinds of different stuff. But the pictures are like these little Polaroid pictures that are just like stapled into reports. And so it's a place that no one would really think of to go look for photos, but they got the most amazing photos of the neighborhood. And, they were just wandering around taking picture after picture. And so there's a lot of people walking around, living their lives, kids like posing in the pictures. There was like a group of kids that we see at a couple different pictures because they were following the photographer as he went. They were all, like when the news shows up or whatever, and all the kids are posing in the background, they're doing that. And so it really captured inadvertently what life was like immediately before the neighborhood was changed. And so we wanted to be able to share some of these photos with people in the community because they were just so inaccessible before. And so the McCall Library worked to blow up those pictures, and we shared them at those different events. And so that was a lot of fun too, to get to. We also shared artifacts at those as well, but definitely the photos were the big hit at those events. So yeah, those are some of, I feel like, wow, I just talked for a long time, but as you can tell, I do a lot of different things. One of my favorite parts about the job is that there's always something different going on, always something new to try and a new skill set to grow. And I get to, yeah, work with a lot of different people and do a lot of different things. So we're always really busy. There's always more to do. But that's also the fun of it.
So you kind of answered this question already, but what has been the community response from the I10 project?
Yeah, gosh, yeah, I mean, people are really interested. I think a lot of people are really surprised. Like, probably the number one question I get is like, well, did you even find anything? Because it's like all along the interstate. So I think people are just really surprised to know how much information potential we still have in Mobile, especially after all the development that's happened. People are really excited to know um, that we've got kind of these layers of history. So we've got like the most recent history, but then underneath shotgun houses, we found woodland pottery, So it's like people building on top of each other for thousands of years, which people are always really surprised and excited to know. I think particularly for the Down the Bay community, they've been much more excited about the oral history project and getting to share those stories and kind of getting to shed some light on that neighborhood just because in Mobile, it's a neighborhood that people have kind of forgotten unless they had some connection to it. So when I moved to Mobile for this job and I heard, oh, we've got this Down the Bay oral history project, like, oh, let me Google that and find out what I can learn about the neighborhood. And almost nothing came up. I actually give a talk about it and I share the two things that came up. And one was like about Hank Aaron because he was born down the Bay. And the other one was kind of like positioning down the bay in relation to kind of Mobile's most famous Black neighborhood, which was the area along, they called it the Avenue. Today it's Martin Luther King Jr. Boulevard. Um, but yeah, people don't really talk about the history of that area very much, even though it has a really integral history to Mobile's history. Yeah, I think a lot of people in Mobile outside down the bay have been surprised to learn how much happened in that neighborhood. But yeah, for people from the neighborhood or with an affiliation to the neighborhood, it's just exciting to see it to get a little bit of attention. And then to get to create this archive of memories at the McCall Library. We've got about maybe 60 or 70% of the oral histories are now available on the online archives. It's called JAGWorks. But hopefully by the end of the year, we'll have all of them up there. So that's just kind of a huge data set and yeah, historical record that didn't exist before this project. So people are excited to share their stories, but also hear other people's memories of the neighborhood as well.
Yeah, I thought that was really interesting when I was there, for a short amount of time as it was. But we were actually, in an open area in a city where people could actually walk by and see what we were doing. Before that, I'd been on remote surveys where it's in the middle of the woods. And if people walk up on you while you're in the middle of the woods, you don't want to trust them.
Yeah,
But the
how'd you
people,
get here?
how did you find us and how can you see me? But the people that we see while we were working in Mobile were just, people out for their morning jog who just want to look at the bay like at sunrise because we did have to be up and out at sunrise. Anyway, but these were people who were just like, on their morning jog, just taking an interest in what we were doing. Several people thought we were working on the sewer line, which was disconcerting, but yeah.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, I hadn't really done much urban archaeology either, and I thought that was a really fun aspect of it that everyone could see what we were doing, especially because a lot of times when we're working in more remote environments, we're not telling anyone where we're working to keep the site location secret. So this was like, oh, everyone already knows where the sites are. So we can kind of share exactly where they are and what happened at them. But then also because of being in an urban environment, we had the Sanborn maps and city directories and census records that let us know exactly who lived at our house or at our sites, which is also something that I'm not used to having. Like usually when you're working in a remote area, you might know who owned the property, but you're probably not going to get a map of exactly where the house was located and who lived next door and all those kinds of records. And so, yeah, having that paper trail and working in an urban environment, that has been like a dream as a public archaeologist because we could actually put names and faces to people, usually just names, but sometimes faces. And it just makes it so much more interesting and relatable. You can see these average people that are just like us, but they lived 100 years ago or 200 years ago and seeing how they moved through the world. So, yeah, I've really enjoyed working in an urban area for a couple of reasons.
And that is something else that I think public archaeology helps with is just transparency in the field in general. People, see like an archaeologist and they're like, oh, you're here to, take our land or impose eminent domain. That's not what we do. We don't have the authority to do that. But it helps, build trust between like academics in the field and just a community in general because they can actually come and ask us and see what we're doing.
Yeah, definitely. It's definitely like a sticky situation in some contexts where, you're trying to protect whatever the resources are. So like on in our project, we've got 13 sites on the Mobile County side that are all right downtown. We did full phase three, and so anyone can kind of know where those are, and everyone can see us working. But then we also had some sites on the eastern shore that were a little bit more remote, and had kind of parts of the site that we weren't excavating that were on private land. And so with those, we were a little bit more sensitive about the site locations. And so it's always kind of a balance of like how much you can share and how much you need to protect the resources. But definitely when we have the ability to share, especially when we're doing the phase three and we're in an urban environment, like, yeah, it's a great opportunity to be like pull back the curtain on what we're doing and show exactly what it is. I think a lot of people were really surprised, like by the heavy machinery and stuff like that too.
Yeah, it's kind of hard to be stealthy when you're bringing in a bulldozer for excavation. They're like, oh, so that's what they're doing.
Yeah.
It's not a subtle piece of equipment.
Yeah, definitely.
So, Rachel, for people who want to learn more about the I-10 project or public archaeology or just want to get involved in archaeology in their community, what would you recommend for them?
Yeah, well, for wanting to know more about the I10 project, definitely I would recommend following along with us. We've got, like I mentioned, our social media. So we're at USA Archaeology. We're on Facebook and Instagram. Um, we've got our website, which is a university URL, so it's kind of cumbersome. But if you Google South Alabama Archaeology, will pop right up. And we've got our blog on there. And I've also been all the things that I mentioned, like exhibits and educational curriculum and things like that are all up there. So people can access them that way. And then also a link to where all the oral histories are kept if people want to learn more about that. And I've been working on a story map that people can access there as well that kind of brings all of those things together in one place. So we've got a map that's got where all the sites in Mobile were, and a little bit of information on each site and that sort of thing kind of links out to other videos and blogs and stuff like that. So I definitely recommend kind of following along and yeah, looking at our website at that sort of thing. Yeah, for people that are interested in public archaeology in general, we started last year the Public Archaeology Conference, which is a great way to get involved. Next year it will be happening. They decided to do it every other year. So next year it will be happening in DC, and Archaeology in the Community is hosting. But we were both there, me and Daniel, and it was a blast. I mean, just hearing what everyone was up to, and it was great for kind of generating new ideas and yeah, kind of making connections with other people that are talking about the same thing. So that's a great way to kind of dip a toe in, or even, at SHA or SAA, finding the people that are doing that type of work. People are also just welcome to reach out to me if they want to talk more. I've definitely loved nerding out about this kind of stuff. And I've learned so much of this role while it's been my full-time job that, yeah, I'm looking forward to at SEAC. I'm working on a poster that is called Sharing Research in Progress. So it's all about like how to kind of think about sharing work before you feel like you have something to share. Because that's what I've struggled with a lot on this I10 project, is that it's all been in progress. We don't have a report. Our artifacts aren't counted and inventoried yet. And so I've kind of had to be creative about how to share things that are still meaningful, and not just like archaeologists dig and we found a privy and things like that. And so if you're at SEAC, come talk to me. I'd love to talk more about that. But also, if you're not going to any of those conferences, my email is rhines, Hines, at southalabama.edu. So I'm happy to talk to people more. Yeah, but I would definitely recommend following us on social media. I'm really trying to get our Instagram to 1,000, so that would help me out.
Well, Rachel, thank you so much for joining me here today. It has been a lot of fun having you on the show.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me. I agree. I hope to see you in person soon.
Yeah, absolutely. So thank you all for tuning in. Sorry, please don't turn in because it's 11:30. Um, thank you all for watching. And Rachel brought this up, so I want to say it too. The programs that we do, like not this show in particular, but public archaeology programs, are in one way or another paid for by you, the taxpayer, and we just want to thank you for contributing to what we do so we can keep doing the things that we love. Thank you all.
Awesome.
Yeah, thank you.
Uh,